Welcome and thank you for standing by. Currently, all participants are in listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host for today, Erling Dow.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the October LED webinar. Before the speaker, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, it will be uploaded to our Census Academy site with all supplemental materials relating to the webinar within 30 days. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Once you've found the Q&A panel, make sure you choose All Panelists from the drop-down menu. This will ensure we see your question. My colleague Tanja will be monitoring the Q&A panel. As time allows, we will answer your questions directly through the Q&A panel, or we will share your questions with the presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, we ask that you do not include any personal or business identifiable information with your questions. We suggest keeping the chat panel open as well. We will be providing key links and other resources throughout the webinar. Keep in mind, you won't be able to respond to the chat. That is for us to send out links and other resources related to the presentation. As you know, we are in a virtual environment and sometimes technical difficulties might occur. If you are having issues, try a different browser, such as Chrome, or consider logging out and coming back into the session. If you are having audio issues, try selecting the computer audio or calling into the webinar via phone. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Aurelia Glass as she presents New Policy Benefits That Lost Manufacturing Jobs. In this presentation, Glass shares her analysis using the Census Bureau's quarterly workforce indicators to determine the percentage of counties with a lower proportion of manufacturing jobs by receipt of private investments. Aurelia is a policy analyst for the Inclusive Economy team at the Center for American Progress with a focus of the American Worker Project, where she researches worker power. She formerly worked as a mechanical engineer before transitioning into the public policy to pursue a master's in international economics and finance at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. She studied both engineering mechanics and economics at Johns Hopkins. With that, I welcome Aurelia.
Great, thank you so much for welcoming me. Yeah, so my name is Aurelia Glass. As Arlene pointed out, I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. We're an independent, nonpartisan policy institute here in Washington, D.C. We offer research for policymakers and the public alike on a wide range of different issue areas. In particular, myself and my co-author, David Badland, who co-authored the report that I'm going to be sharing with you today. We conduct research on ways to increase worker power with a specific focus for this report on research on the effect of federal spending policy on job quality. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share some of our recent work that investigates the impact of recent federal industrial policy spending on different communities. So with that, let's get started. So to really understand why we're talking about this, why we're talking about manufacturing jobs, industrial policy, these things today, we have to understand what brought us to the situation where we're at now. In particular, how manufacturing has shaped the American middle class and how the manufacturing sector in the United States has changed over the last several decades. So the chart that I'm sharing right now is from the St. Louis Fed, and it shows how the percentage of workers engaged in manufacturing as a percentage of total employment, total non-farm employment, has changed since the end of World War II. And as you can see, the decline has been steady since the end of World War II, but in particular, a lot of attention has been paid to the policy decisions that led to a period of decline that really began in the 2000s, and since then has, after the Great Recession, starting around 2009, has led to a flat line in the share of workers in the manufacturing sector. This period, starting in the early 2000s to about where we are today, in the decline in the percentage of workers employed in manufacturing is referred to by a lot of different researchers, such as David Autor, as the China shock. It more generally, though, refers to the impact of import competition on domestic employment starting in the 2000s, and often more specifically with China's accession to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. Of course, this isn't the first time that the United States manufacturing sector has faced import competition from abroad. But one of the reasons that this particular period has a lot of focus is that it's had a lot of appreciable negative consequences for American workers and communities more broadly because of how it negatively impacted employment in communities across the United States, and in particular among workers without college degrees. One study found that a 10 percentage point decline in the share of workers engaged in manufacturing in a given community lowered employment rates in that community by 3.7 percentage points for prime-age men, 2.7 percentage points for prime-age women, and that decline for workers was greater than for workers without college degrees. So really what we saw was that as American manufacturers had to compete and were not able to compete with foreign competition in communities that lost manufacturing jobs, there was a broader decrease in employment in those communities. And not only did the decline in manufacturing as a share of total employment force a lot of workers out of the labor force altogether, it also eliminated a lot of well-paying jobs, that offer union protections and a route to the middle class for a lot of workers. This chart shows research from the Economic Policy Institute, also here in Washington, D.C. It compares the annual earnings of workers without four-year college degrees, median earnings by race and ethnicity between manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors. And as you can see, manufacturing it's traditionally been an important way for workers without college degrees in particular to have a path to the middle class. A lot of these jobs came with strong union protections, and that's a large part of why, the United States has had an interest in retaining manufacturing jobs at home. Obviously, there's a lot of other reasons why the U.S. might have a policy interest in trying to maintain manufacturing jobs here at home. But in particular, this last part, this aspect of middle-class union jobs that are accessible to workers without college degrees, that was the stated motivation behind three major federal investment bills that were passed by Congress in 2021 and 2022. Those three bills are the IIJA, CHIPS and Science, and IRA. IIJA is the the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's also often called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It invested very broadly in a lot of different aspects of America's infrastructure. In particular, there were a lot of investments in clean energy production and in the transition to electric vehicles, with automakers being an example of an industry that still supports a large number of domestic manufacturing jobs. The CHIPS and Science Act came later in 2022 and focused primarily on investments in semiconductor manufacturing, which is historically a field that the United States had led in, but a lot of those jobs began to change as more factories were being opened overseas. And lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act, which also had a lot of investments in EVs and clean energy. And the theory behind these policies was that the government could both provide a lot of direct investments, so direct investments via loans, grants, tax bonuses that could support companies that were investing in United States-based manufacturing facilities and creating jobs in the U.S. But there was also sort of an aspect of indirect encouraging manufacturers to invest in the United States. An instance of that is through the use of domestic content standards. So for instance, an infrastructure project that was receiving federal funding would need to use materials like iron and steel and concrete that were being produced in the United States, which could sort of further encourage the location of supply chains upstream, so that manufacturers would be able to provide more products and create more manufacturing jobs and invest in manufacturing in the United States in order to make these infrastructure projects possible. The White House described this theory behind its investment as crowding in, the notion of crowding in private investment via a large amount of public investment that could further spur more manufacturers to start investing in manufacturing facilities based in the United States. So that was the stated rationale of the policy. Oops, jumped ahead one slide. Yes, so that was the stated rationale of the policy. But when we're trying to assess what the impact of the spending program has been so far, an important question is whether or not these investments are being made in communities that have suffered manufacturing job losses. The researchers have estimated that the three investment packages could create upwards of hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing annually, but these programs are still relatively new. Grants are still being awarded. Companies are still beginning the process of receiving investments and actually, building infrastructure, building manufacturing facilities. And at this stage, spending on manufacturing construction has doubled in the U.S. From 2021, the end of 2021, to mid-2023. And companies are continuing to announce new projects all the time. But it's still not totally clear at this stage what the impact has been on how many jobs are actually being created in manufacturing. So for right now, what we can assess is the location of where the spending is being concentrated. Where are private companies announcing their investments? Where are they actually going to be building factories? Where are they going to be creating these jobs? And this is an important question to answer because a lot of the spread of manufacturing jobs, that decline in the manufacturing share of employment that we were talking about before, that hasn't been evenly spread across the United States. So it's important to consider whether or not counties that have previously lost manufacturing jobs are going to be more likely to have more manufacturing jobs created in those counties as a result of these investments. So our research, what enabled us to do research into this is a database that we have compiled here at the Center for American Progress that tracks announcements of projects that have received federal investments, have received federal assistance. So researchers at CAP have been tracking spending from announcements from usaspending.gov, build.gov, federal agency press releases, press clips from private corporations, announcements from local officials, and have compiled this into a database that allows us to see, what is the awarding agency for a given investment, how much is being invested in it. But the most important for us is where the investments that have been announced by private companies are located. So what we looked at for this, we used an earlier version of this database than the one that's currently available. And when we compiled our research, we did this earlier this year using the version of the database. We found that of all the counties nationwide, 11.9% of them, or 323 counties, had a private company that announced a investment. And this is where the QWI data comes in. So the quarterly workforce indicators are what enabled us to combine this with a look into how manufacturing has changed in these communities. Because essentially what we wanted to know is that our data set that we compiled here at CAP, it allows us to tell whether or not a county has received an investment, whether or not a company has announced that they're going to be investing, creating some kind of manufacturing facility or something in that county. And what we wanted to know was how those counties compare to the rest of the nation in terms of how their change in the share of the total jobs that they have in manufacturing has changed over time. And so in order to do this, we looked at the quarterly workforce indicators. These are job level data that allow us to estimate manufacturing employment as a share of total employment on a county by county basis. And what this allowed us to do is that we could compare what the share of jobs in a given county as a percentage of total employment, what that is today, or more specifically, what that was in 2021, and how that compared to an earlier date. In this case, we use 2001. It's a common reference point that's used in a lot of these kinds of analyses, since it coincides with when China joined the WTO in December of that year, and allows an analysis of how import competition has affected these communities since then. So essentially what we looked at was comparing a county in 2001 versus 2021. Did the share of jobs in manufacturing go up or did it go down? And in this figure, we can see our first results from this analysis. So this compares among counties that received investment and among just all counties nationwide, whether or not they had a shrinking share of total employment in manufacturing from 2001 to 2021. And what we found is that 83.2% of counties that received private investments had smaller manufacturing shares or sectors as a percent of total employment in 2021 compared to 2001. And that is bigger than the percent that we see when we look at all counties. 73.0% of total counties had a smaller manufacturing sector. So what we're seeing is not only that, of course, a majority of counties have had smaller manufacturing sectors in 2021 compared to 2001, but that share was even larger among counties that were receiving investment, which suggests that the counties that were receiving investment were more likely to be counties that have a lower share of jobs in manufacturing than they did in 2001. And the story is the same when we start to look at different time frames. For instance, we instead, looking how the share changed over the course of one decade, and looking at how that share has changed over the years, it tells much the same kind of story. But one limitation that is important to note with this first stage of the analysis is that the particular QWI release that we used, it omitted some data from 3 states, Alaska, Arkansas, and Mississippi, just because there were some delays in getting those data processed and included in the data set. So the last quarter of data that had all 3 of those states is from 2016. So we felt it was important as well to compare this using a shorter time span, one from 2001 to 2016, which of course includes all 50 states. So when we did this comparison instead, what we found is that among all 50 states, again, we found more or less the same result. A higher proportion of counties receiving investments had a smaller share of employment in manufacturing compared to all counties nationwide. To put that figure into numeric terms, 80.8% of counties that were receiving private investment had smaller manufacturing sectors as a share of total employment in 2016 compared to 2001. And that is a higher percentage than among all counties, which 68.7% of all counties had smaller manufacturing sectors in 2016. So again, it tells very much a similar kind of story that counties which received investments were more likely to be counties that had a smaller manufacturing sector. So one thing we wanted to look at, of course, is how other analyses of this data compare. Of course, the big limitation of the data that we've compiled at CAP is that it's not exhaustive. It can't be, right? It's compiled by hand by going through releases from government agencies, announcements for private companies. It's always possible that there's announcements that are being made or investments that are being made that have not been announced, or for whatever reason we couldn't vet and did not make it into the database. But other researchers at other institutions have had findings that align with ours. A group of researchers at the Brookings Institution last year, or earlier this year, excuse me, used a different data set of investments. So they used a data set of investments that was compiled from MIT at the Rhodium Group, and also looked at data that was provided directly from the White House. And instead of looking at counties that lost manufacturing jobs, they look at counties that they defined as employment distressed. So they had to measure if a specific county had a prime age employment gap above 5% and a median household income below 75,000%. So a slightly different measure of what constitutes a change in employment in a county, and also a different set of data that they got their investments from. But they found a similar kind of result, that counties that they described as employment distressed received 60% of investments that have been announced in the strategic sector, which is double the GDP share of those counties and 1.2 times their population share. So on those two bases, GDP and population, those counties were more likely to receive investments. Researchers at the Upjohn Institute also looked at a slightly different thing. They looked at county level trends in job growth. So this wasn't divided investment versus non-investment counties. Instead, they looked at time frames. So they found that counties that had the worst job growth trends prior to 2019 began to experience more favorable trends after 2019. So it's again looking on a county by county basis, but it's not looking at investment versus non-investment. It's just seeing whether or not after 2019 there was a change in how counties that previously had very poor job growth trends had better trends afterwards. And of course, that study has different limitations. It looks, broadly by time period, and a lot of things have happened since 2019, aside from IIJA, CHIPS and Science, and IRA. But again, sort of broadly similar findings. And an additional analysis, again, from researchers at the Brookings Institution, they used the same data set on investments that earlier Brookings researchers had, so the MIT Rhodium Group White House investment data set. Instead, they looked at import penetration data by county, which was most famously used by David Autor in one of his papers. evaluate how individual counties were affected by import competition since 2000. And so they found that the most trade-affected counties received 30% of investments that the private sector has announced since 2001. So again, of course, our data set has some limitations, but comparing it to findings from other researchers, we find a similar kind of results that show, again, that counties that have lost jobs, have lost manufacturing jobs in our particular case, were more likely to receive investments. So to summarize everything that I've gone over, our goal in the report that we did was try to assess whether or not investments are targeting counties that had losses in manufacturing employment. Our strategy to do so was that we combined a data set we had compiled here at the Center for Market Progress on announced projects that have been announced by private companies that received investments via these three laws. We compared that with QWI data on manufacturing employment. And we found that looking at the 2016 to 2001 time period, 80.8% of counties receiving private investment had smaller manufacturing sectors relative to total employment. And that's a larger percentage compared to all counties, in which case 68.7% had smaller manufacturing sectors. And again, these kind of employment trade-affected findings broadly align with other results from other researchers that use alternative data sets. So with that, I'm happy to go to Q&A, so I'm ready to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Aurelia. Before we get to the questions, as a reminder, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab in a couple of weeks. The link has been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the topic. So here we go. The first one is more of a statement, Aurelia. I have started to get familiar with the QCEW, but have not searched the QWI data yet, so not familiar with it. Thanks. Oh, okay. It goes on. It goes on a little further. Let me read it to you. Sorry, my message only included part of my question. My question was, does QWI website have data at the county level? And if so, does it show the number of employed and also the wage/earning data? And is it by sector, NAICS, or by occupation?
Yes, that's a great question. So yeah, the QWI data, it's compiled from surveys that are sent to employers, and it's provided on a county basis. So yeah, you can look at individual counties. You could look at the number of workers that are employed in a given county in a given time frame. And you can also look at the number of workers employed in specific sectors. So in this case, what we did was we did look at NAICS data that allowed us to drill down specifically to manufacturing sector workers. And that was what allowed us to see how many workers were employed in manufacturing as a percent of total employment.
Next question. Can you please provide the link to the full report?
Yes, absolutely. So the link to the full report, I don't know if I can see the chat window, but it's also, it's provided in the presentation as well.
Next question. What percentage of counties increased their manufacturing sector during the same period?
So we didn't look at the number of counties that increased their manufacturing sector. An interesting extension of this, I think, would be to look at maybe over a subsequent period of time, how many counties have had increasing shares in manufacturing, to try to compare, did counties that receive investments actually have, did they increase their manufacturing share or not? That was the stated goal of the policy. So I think that would be an interesting extension of this. We looked at the counties that had a decrease. You'd have to tease out the ones that were statistically similar to zero, the ones that had no change at all. But there probably wouldn't be quite as many of those as ones that gain manufacturing jobs. So it's probably relatively similar as an estimate to the sort of leftover proportion from what we looked at. But you'd want to do a little bit more analysis to find that number.
Next question. Do you have the data broken down by generations? For example, millennials, Gen X, who are applying for these jobs?
That's a really interesting question. we haven't done research in particular on that aspect, at least as far as who's applying for these jobs. This is unrelated to this part. I have done research that looks at generations by their union approval and union membership, and I've done some work in that, but I haven't done it specifically with the investment data.
Next question. Was the analysis carried out at the 2-digit NAICS level? Are there specific trends at the 3-digit NAICS level uncovered in the research?
Yeah, so we did it at the 2-digit level to just break out the manufacturing sector. But I think breaking it out to more specificity as far as different kinds of investments would be interesting, especially because, you know, the manufacturing policies, the industrial policy investments, you know, they're sort of specifically meant to target, you know, like clean energy, semiconductors, EVs, like there's sort of specific industries that they're trying to look at. So I think an interesting extension would be to look at whether or not, you know, to look at how those trends have changed, you know, depending on what the sector is, you know, the sector where those workers actually work.
Next question. Does the data look at manufacturing workers with disabilities within these counties?
Yeah, so we did do some other extensions of this where we looked at manufacturing. We sort of broke it down by different demographic groups. I could follow up with you individually to talk a little bit more about some of the findings that we had. This is just sort of a general overview of total counties, but we did sort of break it down more by different demographic groups.
That appears to be the end of our Q&A session. Now I'll turn it back over. Oh, actually, one just came in. Here we go. I've noticed that many of the manufacturing jobs have been, excuse me, let me start again. I've noticed that many of the manufacturing jobs that have been coming to the areas, foreign direct investments are bringing their own workforce. Are we focused on local or workforce in general?
That's an interesting question. So this was focused on just the workforce in general in these areas. So, you know, I believe if an employer employs a particular person in that area, it would be hard to distinguish whether or not that job is held by someone who had moved there from somewhere else, or from someone who is local to the area. But that would be another interesting thing to look at. Yeah.
I do believe that's the end of the Q&A. I will turn the mic back over to Arlene Dowell.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Aurelia for her excellent presentation. Aurelia, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I hope you found our research interesting.
Great. Well, this concludes the October LED webinar. Please join us next month on Wednesday, November 20th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when Spencer Knoll and Richard Bean present Dynamics of Business Establishments and Firms, a complement to the dynamics of workers. Upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you with future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.